This week on Q&A, our guests are Ronald and Allis Radosh, who have finished their second book as a writing couple. It's about President Harry Truman's 1948 decision to recognize the State of Israel. The title is A Safe Haven.
Allis Radosh, can you tell me how you met your husband?
Well, that's a long story. I met my husband at one of the last demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. It was a faculty demonstration at Columbia University.
What were you doing there?
I was protesting the war in Vietnam, and I had actually met Ron maybe once before. We had both gone to the University of Wisconsin, where he was legendary, but he left before I got there. So we didn't meet until actually that day in 1972 at Columbia University at Pupin Hall.
Why was he legendary at the University of Wisconsin?
Well, I was a history major, and he had already made his reputation both as an historian and in left-wing circles.
Why were you left-wing?
That is a very big question. I arrived at the University of Wisconsin in 1963 when the Vietnam War was just beginning to really heat up and the anti-war movement was really underway. And I got caught up in that. It was really, my peers all around me felt the same way. It was the atmosphere at Wisconsin, so it just seemed very natural to adapt those views, although I really hadn't had them in high school particularly.
Ronald Radosh, what's your version of this story?
Facts are the same. Version may be slightly different. I mean, I went to a very different kind of high school. I wrote about that in my memoir, Commies. I grew up, I went to a high school that I was affiliated with an elementary school called Little Red Schoolhouse, which I dubbed Little Red Schoolhouse for Little Reds. And all the teachers were communists or fellow travelers, essentially. And the alumni of that school reads like a who's who of the old left and the new left. Angela Davis, Kathy Boudin, you can name them, they all went there. Arlo Guthrie, it's Mary Travers, Peter, Paul and Mary. It's a who's who of the left-wing politics and cultural world. So I went to Wisconsin very much on the left, and I became an activist leader in the remnant of the old communist left and then the beginnings of the new left. I was well known in campus. I was a leader of what was called the Wisconsin Socialist Club, which was the premier left-wing group when I left and when Allis just got to the school.
This book, Commies, was written in what year?
Oh, I don't remember anymore.
I think
I have to look it up.
I think it was in 2001. Yeah, 2001.
Yeah.
Right.
You kind of let it all hang out here.
Right. Absolutely.
Why?
Well, I wanted to write a political memoir that was truthful, but I wrote it hopefully with a very light touch and with a great deal of sense of humor and whimsy about the past. It's good to not take yourself too seriously and have a lot of fun writing this kind of memoir, which I did.
If I figure right, you've been married 34 years, 1975. How much of politics was your relationship based on?
Well, I would say in the early years after we met at the anti-war movement demonstration, that for many years we both considered ourselves on the left, and then we pretty much shifted away from that together.
Well, I must say, Allis was so left-wing when I met her in 1972. We had a big quarrel. I was supporting George McGovern for president as the lesser evil, while she wouldn't vote for him because she thought he was too right-wing.
What changed it? I mean, and how would you describe your politics today?
I consider myself a moderate conservative on the center. Some would say liberal or libertarian on social issues. Women's right to choose in favor of gay rights, but against affirmative action, and fiscally conservative, and a foreign policy generally hawkish and leaning more towards a tough national security stance.
We're going to talk about your newest book, A Safe Haven, in a moment, but I want to ask you, how many of these books that your husband has written have you been involved in?
This is the second one.
And
We did a book called Red Star Over Hollywood together about the Hollywood left.
And how do you work together when you do?
Well, we did the two books differently. With the Hollywood book, we each drafted different chapters and then would exchange it. But we felt in this book we wanted a different methodology, so we more or less did the research together. I did a little more of the research. I did a little more reorganizing the materials, did very extensive outlines for each chapter. Then Ron took it and wrote the first draft. And then we passed it back and forth about 5 times and kept working on it.
What book overall is this for you?
Your
14th or 15th?
15th book.
But that
Yeah.
includes edited books. But I think we both think that this is this is definitely the best book we've worked on, and I consider this actually the best book I've been involved in since the Rosenberg file. We're very proud of it. We feel we've accomplished a great narrative history that tells a story that remains fairly unknown and untold. And this was Alice's idea, and she's not a terrific organizer, but having read a lot of literature and novels, she did what most historians don't do. She understands the need to bring in drama and the personal story. So we went through a lot of people's memoirs and oral histories that are generally ignored, especially when foreign policy and academic historians write on this kind of thing.
Let me interrupt because the audience doesn't know what we're talking about. The book overall is about what?
It's about Truman and the founding of Israel from 1945 to 1948 when he recognized the state, making America the first country to do so.
And you say that you were doing some unusual research into people's memoirs.
Yes, I mean, people generally, historians who have written on this topic, there are chapters on it on various books like McCullough's book or Lon Hamby's book, Truman biographies, have to deal with Truman in Israel, and there's generally a short chapter. But people who have written about this have not touched upon scores of memoirs of people who were involved who tell dramatic personal stories. We try to integrate their stories very dramatically in a narrative into the text, so you come upon the story from different views, and you see at the time what the people who were involved, whether they were involved in the UN 1947 partition vote, or whether they went to investigate the situation in Palestine in various commissions. There were British and American commissions that went there. We went combed through all the narratives of commissioners. They all took memoirs or wrote stories about this, and we tied it all together, we think, in a very dramatic way that makes it very appealing to a general public. I don't like, particularly, we both have PhDs in history, writing just for the academy or for the other historians. Because if you read a lot of historians, they don't know how to write. They can be very dull, very turgid. They don't know how to tell a story. And scholarship is important, accuracy is important, research is important, but you have to know how to tell a story and reach people. And that's what we try to do.
Well, as you know, there are only about 6 million people who live in Israel, but there's not a day goes by since 1948 that word Israel hasn't been in a newspaper in this country. So
That's
what
correct.
did you learn as you went through your research? What was the first time you said, wow, I didn't know that?
Well, we were very intrigued by a statement that David Niles had made. He was the advisor on Jewish affairs for both Roosevelt and for Truman. And he came to the conclusion that if Roosevelt had not passed away and Truman had not become president, there probably wouldn't be an Israel. So that really intrigued us to begin with.
What did David Niles say? What was his point?
Well, that's what his point was, that Roosevelt never would have done what Truman did. He would not have encouraged or recognized Israel the way that Truman did.
Why is that?
Did I get that right? Well, Roosevelt during the war was really playing both sides against each other. He was telling the Arabs one thing, we will never encourage a Jewish state, don't worry about it. And he was telling the Jews another, just wait till the war is ended and then you will get justice, and I support the Jewish homeland in Palestine. And he wouldn't have been able to keep this up.
Well, the very last people that Franklin Roosevelt saw before he went after Warm Springs and then had his stroke and passed away a few days later, the last 2 visitors in the White House were representatives of the American Jewish Committee, which at that time was a non-Zionist group, not that favored assimilation in the United States and justice for Jews in America, but did not particularly support the creation of a Jewish state. And he told those two leading representatives that he was scared to death after his meeting with King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, that Ibn Saud frightened him, and that he was very worried about the demands of the Zionists, and he assured them that he would not support a Jewish state, and he would support the rights of American Jews, but not a Jewish state, and that was his position. And that was very significantly the very last interview in the last, but he had told Rabbi Stephen Wise, the Zionist leader, the opposite, a few weeks or few months earlier. So Roosevelt did indeed, to almost everyone, even Winston Churchill in negotiating during the war. Roosevelt told everyone what they wanted to hear.
You say in your book, these are statistics that or facts. FDR died on April the 12th, 1945.
Right.
And that Harry Truman recognized Israel on May 14th, 1948.
Right.
So we're talking 3 years between that.
That's correct.
Let me go to some definitions. What is a Zionist?
A Zionist is somebody who believes the Jews have a right to their own homeland.
Where
and
does
the broadest definition of that.
Where does the word Zion come from?
Well, I guess it was synonymous with Palestine, and or maybe home, because when Herzl, who was the father of modern Zionism, first conceptualized a Jewish state, he wasn't completely sure it was going to be in Palestine. There were any number of places where there were possibilities.
Back in those years, back in the 45 to 48, how many people lived in the Palestine area?
Remember the figures.
Well, by 1945, there were 600,000 Jews in Palestine, but a lot of them had come during World War II. There was always a Jewish presence in Palestine.
The outline of Palestine is what in the land area?
Back then?
Well, there are so many definitions of Palestine. At the beginning, Palestine embraced Jordan. It wasn't until 1922 when the British lopped off Jordan from Palestine as a whole and created a separate country. And then the Zionists would argue that the rest of Palestine was supposed to be the Jewish state. But then, of course, it was partitioned one more time between Israel and a supposedly Arab state that never
The
materialized.
significant thing is that a famous conference of the Zionists in the United States, their world conference, the so-called Biltmore, after the Biltmore Hotel Conference, in what year was that? 1946? 43. They compromised and they made a major decision that even though their conception of a Jewish state would be all of Palestine, including Jordan, and the areas promised under the Peel Commission in 1936 and the Balfour Declaration, they compromised and agreed to a much smaller area that they said they would accept as a Jewish state, which meant that they would accept, when the UN voted for a partition and creation of a separate Jewish state and an Arab state, they won the fight against their more militant factions that did not want to compromise. That was very significant.
For a moment, I'm Harry Truman. I'm sitting
Yes.
at my desk in the Oval Office, and I'm looking around. I'm looking at my State Department and my Defense Department, and I'm looking over toward Israel. What do I see? And I'm looking at the Jews in America, which at the time were, 5 million or so? It's about the same number
5
as it is
million,
now.
yeah.
So I'm looking around. What do I see? I look over at the State Department. Who's over there? And
Well, the State Department is run by what we generally call the Arabists. People in the department who ran what was called then the Near East Desk, which encompassed the dealings with parts of Africa, but with all of Palestine. And they primarily had one position. American policy should be friendly to the interests of the Arab states, because we needed two things without which we could not protect our national security: access to oil, and there were growing investments in oil in places like Saudi Arabia, and secondly, military bases. That was the concern. Since the Arab leaders said over and over again that we would not and would never accept, we would fight to the last drop of our blood, we would never accept any Jewish state in that region. They argued American security and national interests would be violated if a Jewish state was created, and they were adamant about that.
What did he see over at the Defense Department?
A similar viewpoint. In fact, Robert Forrestal was very
James Forrestal
was very anti-Zionist and completely agreed with the Arabists in the State Department. And his main concern was oil, which he said to Truman. And Truman, there's a famous meeting where Truman shoots back to him, "I'm not concerned about oil, I want to do what's right." So this was...
In any case, at any time in this issue, were any of these human beings anti-Jewish?
Some of them are. There's a big controversy about whether or not the man who was most instrumental, most well-known in the Near East desk was a man named Lloyd Henderson. And you could find, if you comb some of the statements, some people have said essentially they believed Henderson did not like Jews and was anti-Semitic. And at times they would verge on making statements that indicated an animosity to Jews as well as to a Jewish state. But on the other hand, they also tried to have a few clever arguments. One thing that other people somehow didn't notice, which grabbed me as soon as I saw it, was a extensive joint letter that Lloyd Henderson wrote, joint memo, very long memo, to Truman on this issue, co-authored with George F. Kennan, famous architect of containment doctrine. And it has Kennan's handmark in terms of the writing and the style. It's clearly written by Kennan, but it was signed by both Kennan and Henderson. And what they said is that one of the reasons you should not have a Jewish state is that it would create a backlash of anti-Semitism in the United States, because Jews would then be seen as having a dual loyalty to the Jewish state and to America, and that would produce rampant anti-Semitism in the United States. So he argued to Truman, if you want to avoid anti-Semitism here, don't support a Jewish state there.
Go back to, I'm sitting in Harry Truman's seat, and I look over toward Palestine. Who runs Palestine in those years after he became president?
Well, the British had the mandate over Palestine.
Where'd they get that?
Well, they received it from the League of Nations after World War I. And they were in control of Palestine.
In what way? Does that mean if I lived in Palestine, I had to answer to a British governor somewhere?
Basically, yeah. And they had 100,000 troops in Palestine.
Back
And much
in
of
those
much of their time they were trying to keep the peace, and there was a lot of conflict there between Jews, between the Arabs and Jews and the British. And finally it came to a head, and the British said, we can't deal with this, we're giving it to the United Nations, let them figure out what's going to happen.
On the other hand, it's important to note that at the time, by the way, some people today might be confused by this, when you refer to Palestinians back then, you were referring to the Jewish residents of Palestine. The Arabs did not call themselves Palestinians. They were Arabs. Palestinians referred to the Jews, and they were called by the Hebrew name the Yeshuv, which means the existing Jewish community. And they had their own administration and essentially a local government that they had created with all the infrastructure of a real government. They were run by a group with elected leaders called the Jewish Agency. Jewish Agency still exists. But then it was the legal governing authority of Jewish Palestine in the so-called Yeshuv. And they had built up, over the years, an actual state within the state. And what is striking is that today is something the Palestinian Arabs today have not done. Despite all the things, the conflict now between Fatah and Hamas, there is no real infrastructure of a Palestinian state in the way that the Jews of Palestine had really built up an existing state. By 1948, and you get this in all the State Department memos written from the American State Department representatives living in Palestine, they would send back the memo, there is really a Jewish state that exists. When we recognize it, we're just recognizing, if we recognize it, they would say to the White House, we're just recognizing reality because the state exists. It's just not recognized.
In your research, did you find any idea of what the American people thought back then?
Yes, there were some polls taken, and one in 1945 actually surprised the Truman administration. It was taken by Hadley Cantrell, and it found that of those Americans, and there were about half of Americans who knew about the possibility of there being a Jewish state in Palestine, the overwhelming majority supported it, and they supported American support for it too. So there was widespread support in the country, for such a state.
Yet we have one reference from, I always forget which senator, what state was he from? Montana, Colorado?
Edwin Johnson from Colorado.
Edwin Johnson, thank you, of Colorado. And the British Foreign Office, actually the embassy here reporting the British Foreign Office in London, reported that Johnson had given a speech that the writer said was as militant and pro-Zionist as any speech he had heard. And that speech had got tremendous support in Colorado. And he said, what you have to understand, there are almost no Jews, if any, in Colorado, and yet they support a Jewish state. And one of the reasons for this is that there was much more so to today, there was a large sentiment of what we call Christian Zionism, of Christians who, based on their analysis of the Bible, as well as their sympathy with the plight of the Jews, supported creation of a Jewish state. And this was not a fringe movement. It was a large mainstream movement. Senator Robert F. Wagner of New York, of course, New York had the largest Jewish population in America, but Wagner was a member of what was called the American Christian Palestine Committee, which Truman for a while had joined too.
When Truman was a senator, he was a member of the organization as well.
So I'm, again, sitting at my desk looking at the UN. What am I seeing at the UN, and how long had it been up there in New York?
Well, the UN had just been created. It was a very new organization, and in fact, there was a question of whether Truman was going to follow through. This was Roosevelt's dream, and then he died before the first meeting.
The UN was Roosevelt's dream?
Yes, and Truman very much wanted to carry on in Roosevelt's footsteps, and there was a question of whether Truman was really going to move ahead and support it, and he did. So this was one of the first decisions the UN had to make.
Who was pushing the UN to get into this?
Well, the British handed their mandate to the UN, so the UN had no choice. It was sort of thrown in their lap, and there it was. What's going to happen to Palestine after the war?
You get a sense reading this, tell me if I'm wrong, that Harry Truman was all alone in that Oval Office having to make this decision, that there weren't a lot of people around him saying, go for it.
Oh, no, that's not true. There were a lot of people on the White House staff who were pro-Zionists and who did encourage him to move in that direction. But he was very lonely, that's for sure.
Well, I wasn't thinking of White House staff so much as his cabinet officers.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there were two, Patterson and Snyder, who I think were more sympathetic towards that point of view.
And when Henry Wallace was Secretary of Commerce, of course, he was sympathetic to it also.
Yeah, very.
But I'm going back to the State Department. And
right.
When you march up to the point where Harry Truman had to make a decision, who was the Secretary of State?
Well, there were three. There was Stettinius, James Burns, and then George Marshall.
George Marshall.
Yes. And Truman was at odds with the State Department over this particular issue. And in fact, this was very surprising. 8 days after Truman became president, he met with a delegation of Zionists headed by Rabbi Stephen Wise, and he told them, I support your goals, your Zionist goals, but I'm very concerned about the opposition of the State Department. And that was right at the beginning of his administration, and that played out over the next 3 years. And Truman was very much caught in the middle. And he wasn't always sure what the right thing to do was.
How much debate was there at the UN?
Oh, at the UN, it was touch and go at the famous partition vote in November of 1947, with Thanksgiving vacation, fortunately for the Zionists, coming right in the middle of the debate, which gave them a little extra day. They had tallied the votes, and so many of the small states that needed American support and aid were on the record as probably going to vote against partition, which meant that the UN would then have to come out for a revised form of trusteeship, run either by the UN or the US, rather than partition. And there was tremendous lobbying, particularly during the Thanksgiving break. Phenomenal lobbying of some of the small states that had not yet made up their mind. And one of the interesting things, much surprising given the status today of The Nation magazine, which is fervently opposed today, if any of your listeners read that magazine, favors either a unilateral state or a binational state, and is very, very critical of Israel today. In the American media, the editor-in-chief of The Nation magazine, a woman named Frieda Kirschway, was a 100% Zionist, committed to the cause of a Jewish state. And she pulled out all the stops to lobby at the UN with very impressive factual material handed to all the delegates, including personal lobbying to all the delegates about the reason why there has to be a Jewish state. And one of the things she came up with, and we have a memo indicating that Truman saw this, she was the first one to expose the very nefarious role of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, El-Hamin al-Husseini, who was the leader of the Palestinian Arabs and had worked with the Nazis and lived in Berlin during the war, where he broadcast throughout the Arab world Nazi propaganda and also organized Arab troops to join the Waffen-SS in Arab areas during the war. She exposed the ties of Husseini and his followers, who are lobbying to run and control the Arab areas, of their Nazi ties. And this hit the delegates tremendously and helped turn some of them against the Arabs who wanted no Jewish state. And she got this obviously from classified State Department material, and we have a memo in the book where Truman said he knew all about this, and they wonder how did she get this, because this is going to create great problems for us in diplomacy.
Did you go back and look at the press coverage in those days?
Oh, yeah.
We did, and that runs throughout the book.
What I mean by that, did you see the the front pages of newspapers, and was it a big story?
Well, at times it was.
Yeah. Oh,
It's,
during
you know,
major
it really-
upheavals and skirmishes, if the Irgun, the militant right-wing Zionists in Israel captured and killed British soldiers, I mean, that would always be major stories. If there were Arab massacres, that would be major front-page stories. The press was filled with reports about
Well,
this.
and with the refugee ships too, especially the Exodus. One thing I found that was very interesting during the book is what actually happened at the UN. And during the course of the UN studying the situation, they created a commission and went to Europe and looked at the refugee camps and went to Palestine and looked at the different communities. And we have a lot of great stories about that. And during that time, the Exodus showed up, the refugee ship carrying Jewish refugees from Europe, and the British just sent their gunships and pretty much demolished the book, dragged the people off, and then tried to send them back to Germany in prison ships. And this was a disaster for the British in terms of PR.
You mentioned in your book also the St. Louis.
Right.
What's the story of the St. Louis?
Well, you could say.
The St. Louis was turned back and sent to...
in 1939, yeah.
Sent to Cuba, right?
It was sent to Cuba.
Right.
But it
They
was a
wanted
ship full
to-
of Jews coming to America.
Coming
Right.
to America, and Roosevelt did not let them land, and he's been criticized for not allowing the boat to come here. And then it went to Cuba, and then the Cubans wouldn't let it land. And Roosevelt's also been criticized that he didn't put more pressure on the Cubans to let it land, and then it went back to Europe.
And of course,
So-
even Truman, the big failure of American policy was to not open up immigration quotas within the United States to let more Jews into the United States who wanted to come here. I mean, in the FDR State Department, you had people like Breckinridge Long, who was known as an anti-Semite, and did not want Jews coming into the United States. And Truman had little success in trying to change immigration quotas in the United States as well. And when these commissions Alice mentioned went to examine what the DPs wanted, and the commissions would go to Palestine, they talked to the Arabs, they talked to the Jewish leaders, and they would then take side trips to the DP camps in Europe.
DP stands for?
Displaced persons. And we have a photo in there they're holding up a sign in English, "We all want to go to Palestine." They spoke to them. At that time, they had no other options. Some may have indeed wanted to come to America, and a limited few did. But they knew their only hope was Palestine. And when the British said, well, just go back to the countries you came from, like Poland, like Czechoslovakia. Well, you know, some of them did go to Poland. We have stories in there. They went back to Poland with their families, and a woman would come back. The Poles killed all of my relatives. I'm the only one who managed to escape. They couldn't go back, and they did not want to go back to the countries they came from for very good reasons. They only wanted to go to Palestine. That was their demand.
What about the two of you? If you, back in those early days, would you have been Zionists?
Yeah, probably.
You come from Jewish families?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we have, you know, a statement from, which Roosevelt official was it? Wasn't Max Lowenthal or, the AJC official who said when they started out.
Rosenman.
Samuel
Yeah,
J.
this
Rosenman,
is
Judge Samuel J. Rosenman, FDR advisor and then Truman advisor, who said, when I started out working for FDR, I was an anti-Zionist. Then as the years passed,
during the war, I was a
non-Zionist. And after the war, I became a Zionist.
If you were what about your families? Where were they from originally?
Well, my great-grandparents were from Eastern Europe, and I didn't grow up hearing very much about Israel or about what happened to the Jews during the war. And, you know, it was kind of, it wasn't being taught in the schools. I didn't have any relatives in Europe.
Can you remember when you first had a consciousness about the Jewish state?
Well, there were always people I knew who were Zionists, who were involved in a Zionist summer camp or Zionist folk dancing. So it was always there on the periphery. I had friends who went to kibbutzes during the summer, but I just was never really involved in it.
And
my parents were part of the old American left. My mother was more of a Jewish anarchist, and my father was a fellow traveler of the communists. Now, the communists, for a time being, when the Soviets supported the creation of a Jewish state, they supported the creation of a Jewish state. But in fact, my parents actually both broke with official left-wing doctrine and always supported the creation of a Jewish state. I do remember them talking about it, being thrilled when Israel was created, supporting it. Some of their friends put in their wills that their money would not go to their children but would go to the state of Israel. They always favored the creation of a Jewish state.
Can you remember when you first thought seriously about the issue?
Oh, yeah, it was a short time after the Jewish state was created. We had cousins who had ended up in Mexico when the Jews fled Europe. And some of these cousins, my second cousins, came through to the United States and stayed at our apartment on their way to Israel. They were doing Aliyah, and they were going to settle in Israel with probably the left-wing Zionist group, Hashomer Hatzair, pro-communist Zionist group. But they came through. So I knew that we had relatives who believed in Israel and were going to settle there.
So take us back to the time that the decision was made. What was the vote in the UN?
It was very close. I don't remember the exact number, but...
Do you remember who was on what side?
It was a very close call. The Zionists had a lot of supporters, obviously, because it won, basically. But
where was the British?
I think the British abstained. They just didn't want to get involved. Yeah. In the end, the British abstained. You really want us to go through all the different areas of who support? Well, the big surprise was that the Russians supported partition, and nobody expected that that was going to happen, because they had been very anti-Zionist. And so that was a really big surprise at the United Nations.
1 week before the famous speech by Andrei Gromyko at the United Nations in favor of a Jewish state, Dean Rusk, who was then in the State Department, I believe, public diplomacy officer, assistant secretary of state, Dean Rusk presented a long memo saying that the Soviets were adamantly opposed to a Jewish state. They would be completely in support of the Arabs, and he explained the strategy, why they were so pro-Arab. No one here expected that.
And the British never expected that.
And if
you
read the text and the words of the Gromyko speech, it was a powerful, moving, humanitarian plea on a deep emotional level for justice for the Jewish people, beyond anything on the issues that really lay behind Stalin's decision to switch his policy sides. The realpolitik was not there in the speech. The speech sounds like a tough Zionist speech that took everyone by complete surprise.
But if you look at the world population of Jews, there are 6 million here and 5 or 6 million in Israel. There are only a couple million in the rest of the world. Were any of these European countries voting for it to get Jews out of their country and move them to Israel?
I think there was a lot of sympathy, especially in Western Europe, for what had happened to the Jews. The French were big supporters of their cause. And I think most of the Western European countries voted for partition.
So at the time of the vote, go back and...
There was a lot of small countries that were in dispute, particularly in Latin America. And countries that needed, the Philippines was a point of dispute. There was a huge effort to try and get the Philippines to vote for partition, with not so veiled threats of cutting off aid and American support and pulling out all the stops. And at the last minute, there was a big division and confusion in the State Department as to what Truman wanted. And Truman finally gave the word, we want to go all out. Truman at first said, look, we don't want to high pressure these states. This is a dependent organization, the United Nations of states that are all sovereign. Let them decide what they want. And then that Thanksgiving break came, and it looked like partition might lose. And Truman then gave the word to his people, go out there, put on the pressure, lobby, and get them to change their votes.
I want to ask about Eddie Jacobson
Right.
and what role he played.
Eddie Jacobson did play an important role. The most important role he played was to open the doors of the White House to Chaim Weitzman, who was very influential with Truman, and together they exerted a positive pressure towards favoring
You should explain who
Israel.
Eddie Jacobson is, because a lot of people
I'll
listening may not
explain
know.
who Eddie Jacobson was. A very old friend of Truman's from Missouri. They had met when Eddie was 14 years old and Truman was 21. And then they didn't see each other after that. But during World War I, they ended up in the same battalion. And Truman asked Jacobson to help him set up a canteen, which Jacobson did, and it was very successful. And it helped Truman get promoted within the Army. And after the war, and when they were coming back in 1919, they were both kind of at loose ends, and they decided to go into business together, and they set up a haberdashery. And it only lasted, 1 or 2 years, and there was a depression, it dissolved. But the two men always maintained their friendship with each other.
This was a close friend. When Jacobson passed away, Truman said he was the only one of his friends who was essentially like a brother. He considered him family. And he said, I cannot imagine life without Eddie being there and being part of my life. Jacobson was not a Zionist. He was a Reformed Jew in a Reformed Jewish congregation who quickly began reading the newspapers and seeing what was happening to the Jews of Europe, and educated himself, and essentially became a supporter and sympathetic to the cause the Zionists were arguing for. And he was very aware of not wanting to use his position as Truman's close friend to pressure his friend, to take advantage of the fact that his old friend was now president of the United States. But he finally said, this is the fate of my people, of my brethren in Europe who are dying by the thousands. And I am part of them. And this supersedes my old desire not to impinge upon the president. So on his own expense, and he always took money from no one. In fact, he used all of his money. He was not a wealthy man, to constantly travel back and forth from Kansas City to Washington, D.C. And finally, in this famous critical meeting, Truman was at times fed up with the pressure he was getting from all sides, particularly the pressure from the growing Zionist movement in America. And he made a strict rule. No more Zionist delegations coming to see me. I just can't deal with them anymore. They're hostile, they're nasty, they're pressuring. I can't take the pressure. The Jewish Agency told Eddie Jacobson, you've got to persuade Truman to see Chaim Weitzman, the grand old man of Zionism. Truman respected Weitzman. Weitzman was a scientist. He had done a lot for the British in terms of chemical and other materials. He was a scientist that the British used in World War I, and the British esteemed Weitzman. And
he helped to pass the Balfour Declaration, which was the first time a Jewish homeland was mentioned in Britain. And as a result of, somewhat as a result of what Ron just pointed out, with his help with World War I armaments for the British. So he had an in with the British elite.
And Truman respected him tremendously as a man of thought and wisdom. And the difference between the militant Zionists who would have mass demonstrations and pressure Truman, there's a famous incident we mentioned where Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, one of the militant Zionists in America, came into the White House and wagged his finger in Truman's face and screamed at him. Truman was red in the face and furious. When he went out, he said to one of his aides, "Never let that SOB in here again. I never want to see him. He is not to come in the White House." And he was wary of the pressure of the Zionists. But Eddie Jacobson said to him, "Please, Mr. President, I have never taken advantage of my friendship with you, but this is really important to me. You know of Chaim Weitzman. You know what he's like. It's imperative that you see him." And Truman thought about it, and he whirled around in his chair and said, "All right, you bald-headed SOB, you win. I'm setting up a meeting with Weitzman."
When was that?
It was after partition, and after partition at the UN, the State Department was trying to undermine partition. They really wanted a trusteeship. And as Ron said, Truman was not seeing any Zionists, and they were getting more and more nervous that partition was going to go down and there was going to be a trusteeship, and they very much wanted Weitzman to get in to see Truman because he would be able to convince Truman. And so this happened after the partition vote and before the Jewish state was declared in that period.
So what was the atmosphere in the administration itself, and what role did George Marshall play in this?
Well, you know, George Marshall came into the State Department as the third Secretary of State, and Marshall essentially knew Europe. He's most known, of course, for the Marshall Plan, reconstruction of Western Europe. And he had a simple thing. When it comes to Palestine, I defer on this to the State Department and the Near East desk and the people who formulate Palestine policy. I'll take their advice. And he said, that was sound. I'm going to go along with him. Marshall was not the one who orchestrated it. As we said, the State Department had been from the beginning opposed to partition. Now, the important thing, and Allis just mentioned, is that after the partition vote, it didn't end. The State Department consciously sought, until almost the last day, to reverse American policy, undermine Truman's decision to support partition, and go back to having the U.S. support trusteeship, another form of the old British mandate that now would be under the UN or even under the United States auspices. And the head of the Jewish agency in New York, Eliyahu Epstein, who became Israel's first ambassador, changed his name to Eliyahu Alath, he said, "This is, as far as I'm concerned, a big conspiracy. And they are really conspiring to overturn established U.S. policy that Truman said he's in favor of." And that it was accurate. It was an accurate picture. He was correct about that. And I think we show very dramatically how much so they literally were conspiring to undermine and change American policy. So you had this famous May 12th meeting only a few days, 2 days before the actual vote in the Oval Office. Truman shrewdly brought in his counsel, Clark Clifford. Clark Clifford was, of course, had by then become actually another Christian Zionist. And he was very close to Max Lowenthal, who's not in the government, but was an informal Jewish advisor to the president. And he had been working with him and fervently believed that the State Department policy was wrong. And what Truman did, much to Marshall's consternation, he said, "What is Clark Clifford doing in this room?" Truman said, "He's here because I want him here." And Clark Clifford presented a point-by-point refutation he had prepared in advance of all the State Department's arguments, knocking them down, which infuriated Marshall. And of course, Marshall said at the famous meeting, "If I was voting and you were running today and you were voting for president, I would not vote for you." And the great thing about Marshall, he did not like the way Truman seemed to be moving. But he was loyal. He said, I'm loyal to the commander-in-chief. I oppose the policy, but I'm not going to publicly make a statement or resign. I will just remain silent. And that's what Truman worked for. I mean, if Marshall had gone public and raised a huge stink, the whole thing would have fallen apart. They got Marshall to remain quiet. And still, no one knew. Truman played very close to the vest. No one knew until May 14th what Truman would do. There was a press conference the day before. What are you going to do if the Jews declare a state, as they said they're going to do? Truman said, I don't know, we'll have to see. But he had already decided, and he had told only Chaim Weitzman. He said, I am going to support a Jewish state when they announce its creation. But he didn't even tell his Jewish advisors. And he then came out, declared the Jewish state, signed the Proclamation of American Recognition, and it was all over.
What was the reaction to the newspapers in those days? Who was supporting and who wasn't supporting? Do you remember?
Well, the New York Times was kind of skeptical. They were not supporting the Zionist position, but at the end they were kind of, they stepped back and said, well, you know, we'll support partition. This is now the policy, and we'll have to see what happens.
If you were an American Jew, why would you, and I know you've got the two, the American Jewish Conference and the American Jewish Committee, one being pro-Zionist and anti-Zionist. If you were an American Jew, why would you not be a Zionist?
Well, there were some American Jews who felt, as Ron mentioned before, that they would be accused of dual loyalty. They were perfectly happy in America. They didn't want their status to be threatened in any way, and they thought maybe the creation of a Jewish state would threaten them.
And then there was a now defunct group called the American Council on Judaism, which had somewhat clout back then, not much. It was a minority group in the Jewish community, but they argued Judaism was just a religion and there was no reason for Jews to support a Jewish state, and it was violating Judaism should be a religion, not involved in politics or international. They was consciously, programmatically anti-Zionist, opposed to the philosophy of Zionism.
And
Well,
then
what
there
do you
were
think-
some-
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, there were some Orthodox Jews also that were against the creation of a Jewish state on religious grounds.
What do you think George Marshall would say today? I mean, if you looked at what's happened over the last 60 years, would he say, I told you so?
He might. I'm not sure.
And what do you both think of what's happened?
Well, you know, one of the things Marshall said, when he met with the future foreign minister of Israel, Moshe Shertok, then Moshe Sharett, right before Truman's announcement, he tried to persuade him, go back to Palestine and tell the Jewish agency leaders not to declare a Jewish state. His argument was all military. What Marshall told him is, look, all my illusions fell apart in China. I tried to get the nationalists and communists working together. I tried to create a coalition. I tried to stop the fighting. The whole thing fell apart. And I thought Chiang Kai-shek could hold the tide and the Chinese communists were advancing. He said, I didn't know that was going to happen. He said, I'm looking at the military situation in Palestine, and you can't win. The Arab armies are going to invade, and you're going to be defeated, and you'll be 10 times worse than you are now, and I know that's going to be the case. So the State Department Marshall, based on his own military experience, believed the Jews of Palestine could not win if the Arab armies invade. And they were wrong about that. They argued that if the U.S. was committed to a Jewish state and the Arab armies invaded, then the U.S. would be forced to send its own troops in. And even Truman didn't want American military involvement. But the Jewish leaders in Palestine were convinced, for various reasons, that in fact they could and would win, and they were right about that, and Marshall was wrong about that.
Who were some of the names of people that were involved back in the, you talked earlier about the Stern Gang, or you didn't mention the Stern Gang, I just did, and the Irgun and all that. Who were some of those early people in Israel, the names that we might know that were there in the beginning?
David Ben Gurion
What did he do?
is the most, well, he was the first prime minister of Israel, and he had gone there in the 1920s or maybe even earlier from the Soviet Union. And he was originated the Histadrut, the large labor union and labor party. And we were very shocked that Marshall didn't know who he was because he was probably the most prominent
Right. He was the leader of the Jewish
yeah.
agency in Palestine, and Marshall, his name was mentioned, and Marshall said, "Who's he? I never heard of him."
Now, another person that Ron mentioned was Eliyahu Epstein, who later changed his name to Eliyahu Elath, and he was very important here. He was another person who came from Eastern Europe, went to Palestine, went through the university, went to the American University in Beirut, spoke 5 languages. Quite amazing how many languages these early people did.
You
And
met, go ahead.
I was just going to mention that he first represented the Jewish agency in America, and then he became the first ambassador from Israel to the United States.
You mentioned several people that have changed their name. Why did they change
Yeah.
their name?
Well, they changed their name. One of the things they did when they created a Jewish state was they wanted to make Hebrew the official language. And even though many of the first immigrants were from Eastern Europe and spoke Yiddish as their native language, an amalgam of German and Hebrew, and that was the language of the Jews of Eastern Europe and of Russia. And they made a rule at first. Yiddish essentially was forbidden. Everybody has to learn Hebrew. It's the language of the Bible, and we're a Jewish state. We go back to biblical times where the Jews settled in ancient Palestine. We're going to create a Jewish state based on our own national identity with Hebrew as the language. So all those, like Abba Eban, the famous first longtime ambassador to the United States from Israel, who was very active then, was a Weitzman was his mentor. He went to Oxford and he was in London, active Zionist. His name was Aubrey Eban, and he changed his name to Abba. They all took Hebrew names. That was the essential reason.
By the way, when you talk about the religious state, the last time somebody told me that only 25% of the Israelis are synagogue going.
That's probably
The
right.
leaders, the founders of Israel, were secular socialist Jews. They were from the labor Zionist movement. Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, Golda Meyerson here, changed her name to Meir. They were all secular Zionists. They created the Labor Party of Israel, which used to be the powerful governing party, now is quickly fading in the 21st century. These were secular socialists.
Why, though, today are so many rules over there based on religion instead of secularism?
Well, they had to make a compromise with the Jews who were religious, and there was a religious Jewish community there to begin with. And part of the compromise was that they were going to let them set some of the social rules, like on the Sabbath, but now there's clashes over that.
We start off talking about when the two of you met and got married. Writing a book together, does that help or hurt a marriage?
Oh, it helps. I think we're great partners. I think it's terrific working together.
Well, it's wonderful. We have this in common. We can travel together to exotic places. We can put together a story, and it's.
We work well together. We have different strengths. Allis, as she said, she's a great organizer. I find it very tedious to organize and put together the material. Maybe it's because I'm getting older. I used to do it when I was younger, writing my first book. She does that. She has no problem with it. She creates this outline and puts this stuff together, chronologically arranges it. Then I do a first draft. I have no problem with. We actually rewrote this book at least 4 times.
Yeah.
The whole book?
The
Well,
whole
we
book,
just kept
over
passing it back and forth
over,
and rewriting
cutting
it.
and rewriting and changing
No.
things.
What's the difference between the beginning and the end?
The
Half the
beginning-
size,
In other words, the first draft versus the last.
twice as long.
Yeah, the first draft's
With
probably twice as long.
too
and then
much
it's
detail.
A process of culling it down, making it readable, cutting out the extraneous parts of it.
How long did you work on the book?
2.5 years.
And what's your
On nights and days. There was one summer we never left the air conditioning house. We never went out to a swimming pool. We
That's
did
true. We
nothing.
missed that summer.
and
missed
what do
the
you
whole
want people
summer.
to get out of the book?
Well, we want them to know the full story of how Israel was created and what Truman's part in it was, and what part the various other players had in it. And we very purposely did it as a narrative history, so you really see the story from the beginning to the end.
You can see, as you say, Truman sitting in the White House and how he's pressured and how he responds on a month-by-month basis. As one of the people who wrote a blurb for us, I think it was Cokie Roberts, said, this puts you in the White House and you can see Truman responding and deciding what to do. It's a great story of presidential power and how it plays out and how he made decisions and what led him to take this dramatic step.
Last question for you. The name Radosh,
Yeah.
where did that pronunciation come from?
That's the way my parents pronounced it. Everybody
But you
usually
thought it was
mispronounced it. It's
originally
probably
longer.
Radoshevsky or something much longer. I think my father's father was a rabbi in Poland, in the same town, which I can never pronounce, that the Black Madonna comes from, Częstochowice, something like that, in Poland. And they grew up, and my father left the small town and went to Warsaw and then came to the United States. It was a Polish Jewish name shortened in the United States.
We're out of time. Allis and Ronald Radosh, thank you very much.
Well,
And the
thank you
book
for
is
having
called,
us.
A Safe Haven, Harry S. Truman and the Founding of Israel.
Thank you so much.